So when we're thinking about release candidates, think about what has to be deployed. Okay, this is another part for automated DevOps that you need to do in iteration 0. Whenever you're laying down a new Git repository, do this right off the bat after your integration build succeeds. And I put it in the same PowerShell script as the build. It's just a package task. And so let's see if we have a web application. Great. We're going to have a deployable package for a web application. We have an offline job that just sits there and watches a Azure Service Bus queue. Okay, that's just an offline job. And whether or not we deploy it as a service worker or we deploy it to an Azure function or app service, doesn't matter. It's another deployable process. So it needs to have a package. The SQL Server database schema, it's going to be deployed to Azure SQL. It's a package. And our full system acceptance tests, those have to be deployed to our build server agent. And so that's a package. So we have 4 different packages, and then we need to push it to either Azure Artifacts or the NuGet server inside Octopus Deploy. Those are kind of like the 2 choices in the industry. There's a few smaller choices, but these are the big guys. And the NuGet format is still just the best drop dead simple package type. I mean, after all, it's just a zip file with a different extension and an additional manifest layer built on top of it. Could you use regular old zip files? Sure, you could. But when you do that, you're going to end up embedding more information in your naming convention of the file than is necessary. So I found the NuGet package to be super easy. And Octopus Deploy also has a open source tool that kind of layers on top of NuGet. That is a tool that installs into .NET.exe. You actually, when you look at the build script of this application, you'll be able to see that in use. All right, and of course, if you look at Azure Artifacts, this is what it looks like with three deployable pieces of our application. Well, this sample application didn't have the offline job, but I just threw that in for illustration. Okay. And for deployment, we're talking about iteration 0 again. For deployment, we want to deploy to a production-like environment on the first day of iteration 0. Now, you might say, hey, this is going to take multiple days to get all this set up. Well, if you were inventing all of it, and if you were figuring out every step, how it needed to be, and creating all these patterns from scratch, yeah, I'd say I would agree with you. But you don't have to do that. All you have to do is grab the Git repository that I showed you the URL for and just modify it. Use it as a template. You don't have to invent any of this stuff. And if your application isn't a Blazor app, if it's something else, great. Delete the Blazor projects. They were just stand-in projects anyway. Keep the build script, keep database, keep the core, keep your unit tests, keep your integration tests, and throw in a WPF project or whatever your application needs to be, okay? But use templates. Use the build script template that I gave you. If you were to, I challenge any of you, clone that build repository and just run click to build.bat, which by the way, just calls build.ps1, and it'll run for you, okay? It'll run for you. And then now you do need to have SQL local DB installed locally, but Visual Studio, unless you've modified it, Visual Studio defaults to installing that from scratch anyway. And then when we're deploying, we need to choose our deployment architecture, okay? And this is kind of out of scope for today. We only have about 10 more minutes, but you have a progression of choices on what environment types you want to use. For a long, now you may have some scenarios where you have to install it in your own physical data center cabinet where you could put your hands on the actual hard drives that are storing the data. And some customers will require that in some situations, but a large percentage is regular business software. There's nothing holding it back from going straight up to Azure. And so I always look to Azure serverless resources first, and then just make sure that there's not a dependency or a requirement why that wouldn't work. So that's my go-to. And Azure App Service with Azure SQL database. And then of course add on Azure Service Bus, SignalR, all kind, whatever other resources to complement that. But as far as starting something new, you always tend to have a database. You always tend to have some relational data. And then even if we have file data, blob data, JSON data, we kind of layer it on top of that. But you always have a SQL Server database, unless it's just a highly specialized microservice that's really small and just incoming and outgoing. And so that's been my favorite. Now Azure Container Apps builds on top of app service and gives you the power of a hosted Kubernetes cluster where you don't actually have to set up and maintain the whole Kubernetes cluster. It just kind of runs it for you. You throw a container into Azure Container Registry and it just deploys and runs it. So that's pretty cool. And I've done some previous webinars a few months ago on .NET 7 and Azure Container Apps specifically. So if you're interested in that, just look in our webinar archives.